Life in 1963, when a handshake was all you needed to close a deal. Back in 1963, a man's word was his bond. That wasn't a saying. That wasn't a motivational poster on someone's wall. That was just the way things worked. You looked a person in the eye, you said what you meant, you put your hand out, and that was it. Deal done. Contract signed. No lawyers, no paperwork, no fine print hiding something ugly at the bottom of the page. Just two human beings deciding to trust each other. And you know what? It worked. It worked for generations. It built this country. I want to take you back there today, back to a time when trust wasn't a transaction, when your reputation in a town wasn't something you managed on social media. It was something you built slowly, day by day, year by year, through the way you kept your promises and showed up when it mattered. That's the America I want to talk about today, the America of 1963, when business was done face-to-face, man-to-man, over a cup of coffee at the diner on Main Street. Think about what 1963 looked like for a moment. John F. Kennedy was in the White House, young and full of fire, and the country felt like it was on the edge of something big. The space race was burning hot. Rock and roll was changing the radio. The muscle car era was just getting its legs under it. Fords and Chevys rolling off the line with that deep, beautiful rumble. The country was moving, changing, growing. But underneath all of that, there was still a bedrock that hadn't shifted yet. And that bedrock was trust. The kind you earned, not the kind you manufactured. The civil rights movement was shaking the conscience of the nation. People were marching and standing for something real. And even in the middle of all of that change and tension, the everyday world, the world of business, of neighbors, of community, still ran on a currency that had no dollar sign on it. It ran on character, on reputation, on the simple, powerful act of keeping your word. Let me paint you a picture. It's a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1963. A small town somewhere in the American heartland. Could be Ohio, could be Tennessee, could be any one of 1,000 towns that looked and felt exactly like this. The diner on Main Street opens at 6. The owner, a man named Earl, has had the place for 20 years. He's got a coffee urn the size of a small car and a grill that's been seasoned by decades of bacon grease and honest labor. By 6:15, the place is half full. Farmers in overalls, the hardware store owner, the insurance man, a couple of guys from the factory on the edge of town. Nobody made a reservation. Nobody needed to. At the counter, two men are talking. One is a farmer named Dale who's got 40 acres and needs a new tractor but doesn't have all the money yet. The other is the man who sells farm equipment out of a lot on Route 9. His name is Harold. Harold listens to Dale lay it out, what he needs, what he can pay now, what he can pay after harvest. Harold drinks his coffee. He looks at Dale. He's known Dale his whole life, known his father before him. He knows Dale's a man who has never in his life owed a debt he didn't pay. So Harold sets his cup down and he says, "Dale, you take the tractor. Pay me when the corn comes in." No contract, no credit check, no interest rate calculated on a spreadsheet by someone in a city who has never set foot on Dale's farm. Just two men who knew each other and trust that had been built over a lifetime of showing up. Dale would pay. Harold knew it. Dale knew Harold knew it. And that was enough. Now, this wasn't just farmers and neighbors. This was how business got done at every level of everyday American life in 1963. The corner store owner knew his customers by name. He knew which ones were going through a hard month, and he'd let them run a cab without a word of embarrassment about it. You'd come in, get your groceries, and he'd write it in a little notebook kept under the counter. No digital record, no automated reminder, just the understanding between a merchant and a neighbor that things would be squared up when they could be. The hardware store worked the same way. A man would come in and say he needed lumber and supplies to fix his roof before winter hit, but the money was a little tight right now. And the owner would say, "I know you, Bob. Take what you need. We'll work it out." Bob would come back in the spring, maybe with a little extra to say thank you, maybe with a dozen eggs from his wife's chickens. The economy of a small town in 1963 wasn't just dollars and cents, it was relationship. It was a web of mutual dependence and mutual trust that held a community together like nothing else could. And get this, it worked. Losses from bad debt in those small businesses were remarkably low, not because people were perfect, but because nobody wanted to be the person in town who didn't pay their debts. Your reputation followed you everywhere, to church on Sunday, to the barber on Saturday morning, to every potluck and every school play and every funeral. A man who didn't keep his word didn't just lose a business relationship, he lost his standing. And in a small town in 1963, your standing was everything. Now let me tell you about the handshake itself, because it wasn't just a gesture, it was a ritual. It meant something specific, and it was executed with care. You didn't just grab someone's fingers and give a limp little shake, Lord, no. A proper handshake in 1963 was firm. You met the web of the other man's hand full on. You gripped with confidence. You looked him dead in the eye, not aggressive, steady. You shook once, maybe twice, and you let go clean. That was it. That was the seal. That was the signature on the dotted line before there were dotted lines. Fathers taught their sons how to shake hands the way they taught them to tie a tie or bait a hook. It was considered a fundamental life skill. A boy who offered a weak handshake was embarrassing to his family. A man who looked away during a handshake was not to be trusted. People read volumes into those few seconds, and they weren't wrong to, because that handshake was a window. It told you whether the man in front of you was confident in what he was promising, whether he was used to keeping his word, whether he respected you enough to meet you honestly. I'll tell you what, there are people today who have signed 100 contracts and broken half of them, and there were men in 1963 who shook hands once and never wavered. The paper didn't make the promise, the man made the promise. And in 1963, most men understood that. Let's talk about what a business deal actually looked like back then. Not a big corporate deal, though those had their rituals too. I'm talking about the kind of deal that happened between ordinary Americans in the course of their ordinary lives. The real estate transaction where two neighbors agreed on a price over the fence in the backyard. The deal between a contractor and a homeowner done at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and a handshake at the end. The arrangement between a landlord and a tenant that started with, "I know you're good for it," and ended with a handshake that both men honored for years. You'd sit down together. There was almost always coffee or maybe something stronger depending on the time of day and the part of the country. You talked first, not about the deal, about life, about how the kids were doing, how the crops looked, how the wife's sister was getting along after the surgery. Because before you could do business with a man, you needed to know who he was. That wasn't small talk, that was due diligence 1963 style. You were reading him. Was he the kind of man who asked about your family and actually listened to the answer? Was he the kind of man who laughed easy and carried himself straight? Was he in good standing with the people you both knew? And when the conversation finally turned to business, it was direct, no dancing around. You said what you had, you said what you needed, you listened to the other side. You found the middle if there was a middle to be found. And when you both agreed, you said so plainly, "We've got a deal." You put your hand out, he took it, you looked at each other, and that was that. Now, were there bad actors? Of course. There have always been people in every era who said one thing and did another. The con man is not an invention of the modern age. But in the America of 1963, particularly in smaller communities, in the towns and neighborhoods where most Americans lived, the social cost of breaking your word was severe enough that most people simply didn't do it. Your word was an asset you couldn't afford to squander. And the remarkable thing is, the whole system ran on almost nothing: a man's word, a firm handshake, and the shared understanding that your reputation was the most valuable thing you owned. It cost nothing to produce and everything to maintain. Banks understood this. Local banks in 1963, not the big national institutions, but the first national bank of wherever you are that had been on Main Street since the 1890s, those bankers knew their customers personally. A loan wasn't just a credit score, it was a story. It was the story of who you were and how you'd lived, and whether the people in that community could vouch for you. The banker might know that your daddy paid off his debts even when things got hard during the Depression. He might know that you'd been showing up to the same job for 15 years without missing a day. He might know your wife's family and how they'd always been solid, stand-up people. All of that went into the decision. It wasn't cold, it wasn't algorithmic, it was human, and often it was right. Can you imagine bringing your father or your grandfather into a bank today and watching their faces as someone explained a credit score to them? The very concept would baffle a man from 1963. You mean to tell me that a number calculated by some company you never heard of, based on formulas you'll never understand, decides whether you're worthy of a loan? Not your history in the community, not your word, not the fact that your family has banked here for 40 years, just a number? Yes, sir, that's how it works now. And I'm not saying the old way was perfect. There were real inequities in who got to benefit from that handshake economy and who didn't. That's a truth we have to hold. But there was also something in it, something about the primacy of character, of relationship, of your actual lived reputation among real people who knew you that we lost when we traded it for the efficiency of data. Something we're still trying to name because we can feel the absence of it even when we can't quite say what it is. Let me take you to another scene. It's a Saturday morning in 1963. A man named Raymond is about to buy a used car from his neighbor Bill. Bill's selling a '58 Chevy Bel Air, dark green, white roof, the kind of car that looks like it was designed by someone who believed that beauty was part of the deal, not a luxury extra. Raymond's been admiring it in Bill's driveway for 2 years. He knows Bill takes good care of his vehicles. Bill knows Raymond's a careful man, not going to beat that car to death on dirt roads. They meet in the driveway. Bill lifts the hood and shows Raymond what's under there the way a man shows off something he's proud of. Raymond looks, nods, asks a couple of questions. They take it around the block, come back. They talk price. Bill says a number. Raymond says a little less. Bill thinks about it. They meet in the middle. Bill says, "You'll take care of her." Raymond says, "Like she's my own." Bill nods. They shake hands. Raymond goes inside and comes back with cash in an envelope. Bill counts it without embarrassment, nods, and hands over the keys. No Carfax report, no third-party inspection, no digital title transfer, no dealer fees hidden in the paperwork. Two neighbors, 40 years of knowing each other, one handshake, and a dark green Bel Air changing hands on a Saturday morning with the smell of cut grass in the air and a neighbor's dog barking somewhere down the street. That's how it was done, and it was beautiful in its simplicity. The world of work in 1963 ran on the same currency. A man got hired not just because he had the right qualifications on a resume. In fact, many men in 1963 were hired because someone knew someone who could vouch for them. "He's a good man, I'll tell you that. Showed up every day at my shop for 6 years, never gave me a minute of trouble. You take him on, you won't regret it." That was a reference, not a box on a form, not a LinkedIn endorsement, a real person putting their reputation behind someone else's. And when a man was hired, the deal was struck clearly. The boss would say what the job was, what it paid, what was expected. The worker would say whether he could do it and what he needed to do it well. They'd agree. And from that point forward, both men were held to what they'd said. The boss didn't change the terms without a conversation. The worker didn't cut corners or disappear without a word. There was a dignity in it, a mutual respect that didn't require a human resources department to enforce it. Promotions worked the same way. A man would be called into the office, the boss would say he'd been watching and he'd seen good work and he thought it was time. He'd name a new title and a new number. They'd shake hands. That was the promotion. No performance review matrix, no 360-degree feedback from colleagues who barely knew you. Just a man who'd been paying attention and another man who'd been working hard, reaching an understanding between them. Now think about what this world required of ordinary people. It required you to be present, actually present, not just physically, but mentally, morally, relationally. You had to know your neighbors. You had to be known by them. You couldn't drift through your community without leaving a mark, because your mark was your credit. Your mark was what determined whether someone would shake your hand and mean it, or just shake it to be polite and then walk away thinking twice. It required you to tell the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. If you'd made a promise you couldn't keep, you went to that person and told them before they found out another way, because a broken promise that you disclosed was a mistake. A broken promise that you hid was a betrayal. And in a community that ran on trust, betrayal wasn't just a personal failing, it rippled out. It damaged not just your reputation, but the whole fragile ecosystem of trust that made the community function. It required you to think long-term. In 1963, you didn't optimize for the immediate transaction. You optimized for the relationship. Because that relationship, with the hardware store owner, with the farmer next door, with the banker on Main Street, was going to span decades. You were going to need each other again and again and again. So you treated every handshake not as an isolated event, but as one moment in a long, ongoing story between you and another human being. I want to tell you about one more scene because I think it captures something essential about that world. It's an evening in late October 1963. A man named George has just lost his job at the mill. The mill's cutting back, and George is one of 20 men let go on a Friday afternoon. He's got a wife and 3 kids and a mortgage payment due in 2 weeks. George doesn't panic. He gets up Saturday morning, puts on a clean shirt, and starts making the rounds. He goes to the diner and has coffee with Earl, tells him the situation plainly. Earl says he's sorry to hear it and tells him to send his wife in for groceries. They'll run a tab. George goes to the hardware store. Same conversation, same result. He goes to the church and tells the pastor, who says they'll keep an eye out for any work, and there'll be a food basket from the congregation next week. No need to ask. By noon, George has walked his whole community, and his whole community has walked back toward him. Not with pity, with practical human solidarity, because everybody in that town had been through something. Everybody knew what it was to need a hand. And everybody understood that the hand you extended today was the hand that would be extended to you tomorrow. That's not charity, that's community. That's what it looked like when people trusted each other enough to be vulnerable and trusted each other enough to show up. We talk a lot today about wanting community, about feeling disconnected, about the loneliness epidemic, the loss of belonging, the sense that we're all just strangers passing through the same spaces without ever really touching each other's lives. And I think part of what we're reaching for, without always knowing it, is something like what existed in 1963. Not the specific technologies or the specific cultural moment, but the underlying architecture, the web of mutual trust and mutual obligation that made people visible to each other, that made them matter to each other in concrete, practical, everyday ways. We talk a lot today about wanting community, about feeling disconnected, about the loneliness epidemic, the loss of belonging, the sense that we're all just strangers passing through the same spaces without ever really touching each other's lives. And I think part of what we're reaching for, without always knowing it, is something like what existed in 1963. Not the specific technologies or the specific cultural moment, but the underlying architecture, the web of mutual trust and mutual obligation that made people visible to each other, that made them matter to each other in concrete, practical, everyday ways. The handshake wasn't magic. The handshake was the symbol of something that had to be built over time and maintained with intention. It was the visible sign of an invisible infrastructure, of all the conversations had, all the promises kept, all the small moments of showing up and following through that made two people willing to put their hands together and say, "I trust you. I give you my word. That's enough." Kids today will never know what it felt like to walk into a store and be known, to have the owner look up and say your name before you said a word, to know that if things got hard, the people around you would notice and do something about it, not because there was a program for it, but because that's what people did for each other. That was just the deal. You were part of something. You had responsibilities to it. It had responsibilities to you. It's different now. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you everything about 1963 was better, because it wasn't. There were people in that America who were locked out of that handshake economy entirely, who weren't extended the same trust, the same credit, the same basic dignity. That was wrong, full stop. And the fight to change that was one of the most important things that happened in that decade and the ones that followed. But there's something we can take from that era that doesn't require us to take the bad parts with it. We can ask ourselves, am I building a reputation that people can trust? Am I the kind of person whose word means something? Do I know my neighbors well enough to help them when they need it and to let them help me when I do? Do I treat every transaction not just as a transaction, but as a moment in a longer relationship with another human being? You are part of something. You have responsibilities to it. It had responsibilities to you. Those questions don't belong to 1963. They belong to every era. They belong to the men who built this country with their hands and their promises and their sheer stubborn willingness to be honorable. They belong to us now if we want them. The handshake didn't close the deal because of some legal magic. It closed the deal because two people had decided to be the kind of people whose handshake meant something. We still get to make that decision every single day. I think about Dale and his tractor on those 40 acres. I think about George walking his neighborhood on that October Saturday, clean shirt and straight back, telling the truth about where he stood. I think about Raymond and the dark green Bel Air and two neighbors meeting in a driveway on a Saturday morning. I think about Earl at the counter pouring coffee for men who'd earned each other's trust over decades of showing up. And I feel something that doesn't have a perfect name but sits right in the middle of the chest. Gratitude, maybe. Grief, a little. Hope, if we're honest. Because those people built something real. They built it without apps or algorithms or legal departments. They built it the hard way, the only real way. One word kept, one promise honored, one handshake at a time. And you know what? There was something beautiful about living in a world where your word was the only currency that really mattered, where trust was the foundation everything else was built on, where the most powerful thing you could do in a business transaction was look another person in the eye and mean what you said. We didn't know it then, not all of us, not fully, but we were living inside something precious, something that had taken generations to build and would take less than a generation to begin to lose. Now we understand what it was really worth. Now that the diner on Main Street is a parking lot and the corner store is a chain and the local banker has been replaced by an algorithm and the handshake has been replaced by a 40-page contract written by someone whose job is to assume that everyone is lying, now we understand Now we get it completely. But carry this with you. Carry the idea of it in your own life, in your own community, in the way you do business and keep promises and show up for people. You can be someone whose handshake means something. You can be someone who builds that kind of trust slowly over time in the old way. It's still possible. It's still worth it. And the world still needs it. Well, I hope this story touched you today. I hope it brought something back. Maybe a memory of your own. Maybe a story your father told you. Maybe just a feeling you didn't have a name for until right now. These stories matter. They remind us who we are, where we come from, and what we're capable of being. The America of 1963 had its flaws, like every era, but it also had men and women who knew the value of their word. And that's something worth remembering. That's something worth being. If this story meant something to you, go ahead and give it a like. It helps more people find these stories, and these stories deserve to be found. Drop a comment down below. I want to know, did your parents or grandparents tell you stories about doing business on a handshake? Did you live it yourself? Was there a moment when someone trusted you that way and it changed how you saw yourself? Tell me. I read every single one. Share this with someone who needs a little reminder of what trust looks like when it's real. Your dad, your granddad, your friend who's feeling a little lost in the noise of today's world. Sometimes all it takes is one story to remind us that things were different once, and that means they can be different again. And subscribe if you haven't already, so you never miss one of these stories. We come back here every week to remember together, to honor the generations that came before us, and to find in their lives something we can carry into our own. You belong here. We're glad you're with us. Take care of yourselves, folks. Keep your word, and we'll see you in the next story.